Now we invite our father, Dr. Usman Bugaje, who is going to be joining us. Dr. Usman Bugaje, as we all know, is an Islamic scholar, a historian, somebody that has been very active in the political space for many years. And therefore, we will now learn from him his experience and knowledge on this very important subject. Dr. Bismillah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. My apologies for not being there physically. I would have very much loved to do so. It was entirely my fault. I had too many things in my hands and it escaped my mind and I gave a commitment outside the country. And that's why I had to prioritize. And being that this is home and I can always connect by Zoom, I decided to travel, make the other commitments. So my apologies. I don't want to take too much time. The two scholars have done a very good job, Professor Zunurain and Barrister Ibrahim Atahiru, and I just want to build on what they have done and try to see if we can look at other perspectives or other dimensions. The debate about Islam and democracy is a very old one. I mean, some 50 years, at least some of us have been familiar with that debate. And before that, there were debates about whether socialism is admissible in Islam or whether it can be practiced by Muslims, knowing how close some of the concepts and ideas are. Now, this is something we have been discussing among scholars, among activists, among Muslim policy makers, among quite a number of circles, without a very clear end. Of course, in the last few years, a lot has been achieved, a lot of perspectives have come out, but I think the dimension we need to look at is we need to do our own critique of democracy. Now, that has not been done very well. And the starting point is to locate democracy within the intellectual tradition of the West. In other words, we need to understand Western intellectual history. How did it come about democracy? And then we need to give depth to our own understanding of the Islamic system of governance, Islamic system of economy, and other components that put together, provide for the Islamic system of society or Islamic system for which puts together the whole conceivable areas of human endeavor. So if we go back to the history of the West, yes, a lot of the ideas of democracy are linked to the Greek societies, some 2,000 years plus. But as we know, there has been a break, especially the coming of the Holy Roman Empire, the joint enterprise between the Catholic Church and the Roman government, so to speak, that formed, which ruled for a very long time in Europe. And it was basically the reaction to the Holy Roman Empire's rule that actually gave the momentum to the intellectual history of the West. In other words, a lot of the ideas that were developed towards the end of the Holy Roman Empire were ideas also that were largely borrowed from Islam. the idea of the Renaissance, which started about the 14th, 15th, 16th century in Italy, particularly around the place called Florence, is the starting point. And you can say from the Renaissance to date, you can identify three clear waves of intellectual, if you like, momentums, and some of them taking different trajectories. The first wave is the wave of, if you like, Renaissance. That's basically reawakening of Europe from what was called the Dark Ages because of the terrible rule of the Holy Roman Empire, which was justified by the Catholic Church. And so the first wave were the wave championed by scholars like Dante Alighieri. And you can see clearly they were very religious in their own, but they were not inspired by Christianity. They were inspired by Muslim scholars. And one of the classical work of Dante Alighieri, the Divine Comedy, is largely a copy of the work of Ibn al-Arabi. And some of the quotations that Dante Alighieri was, or is still famous for, are basically an ayah of the Quran. I mean, Dante Alighieri is known for his statement that in times of moral crisis, anybody who seeks to be neutral will find himself at the bottom of hellfire, which is basically a kind of rendition of "Inna al-munafiqina fi ad-darki al-asfali min an-nar." So you can see the influence is very obvious in a lot of the work of these scholars. And the second wave is a wave, you might say, championed by Voltaire, who was born in the middle of the 17th century and continued until towards the end of the 18th century. And Voltaire is a philosopher, is a poet, is a playwright, and he represents a generation of scholars that were much more bold or bolder than the earlier generation. And they basically create that break between the Holy Roman Empire or the Catholic Church or Christianity generally with the a more liberal Europe, a more liberal West. But they remained Christian. But you might say that the real blow to the Holy Roman Empire were by this generation of scholars. And Voltaire is famous for dismissing the Holy Roman Empire as being neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And that basically put the end. But then came another wave led by scholars like Friedrich Nietzsche, the German scholar, who now started debating about whether it is even necessary to have God in human life. In other words, books or debates were very much alive in the mid-19th century about the future of God. And Nietzsche himself wrote a book about the death of God. So that's the beginning of a secular Europe. And that is actually when democracy started, because democracy in the shape and form we know it today is not very long ago. It's basically 200 years, or so. So it's not like something that has actually stayed along for a very long time. It's an idea that was being experimented recently. And democracy, even today, has a lot of critique from the West itself. And one very important critic is C.S. Lewis, who basically attacked the whole idea of democracy. And he was an atheist. Later on, he converted back to Christianity. But his own argument, I can't bring everything here, but his own argument is to say that democracy is reductionist in the sense that it takes the vote of, if you like, a professor of a university and the vote of his own driver to be the same. And his argument is that if a professor is going to make a choice, he's going to leverage the knowledge that he has, which is supposed to be quite a big chunk of knowledge. When somebody at that level of social ladder is going to make a choice, is going to leverage that little knowledge. So these votes cannot be the same, but in democracy, they are the same. So there are lots of critique. So I think what we need to perhaps do is to understand democracy in three, perhaps three, if you like, perspectives. One, its own genesis. How did it develop? You know, the intellectual and social context within which it developed. And then also to look at it today as an instrument of Western supremacy. It's being used as an instrument of Western control and supremacy. And also to look at democracy in terms of how much of, if you like, how much democracy supports the other Western forms of human organization. In other words, it supports other support, for example, the economic system, and it maintains that hierarchy within the global power politics. So these are some of the dimensions we need to explore. But at a very elementary level, if you take democracy and say, okay, what defines democracy? And I know Zunurain has done quite a lot in this. I would say that 5 key issues or areas define democracy. First, freedom of choice. I mean, both freedom of association and freedom of choice of leaders, freedom to be consulted, equality of votes, rule of law or due process, and human rights. Now, if you look at Islam, you can see clearly in terms of freedom, the freedom that Islam has given is in fact far more than the freedom that democracy has given you. Because while democracy has given you freedom, within democracy, Islam has actually given you freedom even to reject Islam if you so wish. لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي. In other words, if you look at consultation, democracy allows different forms of consultation. But then Islam guides you. You cannot consult people who don't have knowledge on the matter. So the quality of consultation, because Islam says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And this is where the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqad came. You know, I mean, in Islam, for example, you don't consult somebody who does not have any knowledge on the subject. You go to scholars. In matters that, for example, in matters of agriculture, you go to those who know agriculture. In matters of technology, you go to those who know those technology. Those who have got knowledge of the thing is who you consult. But at the same time, it still allows people, the generality of people, to still participate in consultation by allowing them to do bay'ah after the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqad may have done their job of selecting leaders. In other words, the quality of consultation and the fairness is much, much, much more robust when you look at what Islam provides, as different from the very narrow space that democracy or Western liberal democracy. The same with equality. Islam emphasizes equity rather than equality, because equality can easily create problems that you don't, and this is part of what is happening in the social system of Europe. But equity allows you to have equality. At the same time, you also have a preservation of the ecosystem without disrupting it. And therefore, you get the best out of the system. The same thing with rule of law. The same thing with human rights. So the point I'm making is that if we take democracy by those features that define it, and then examine the quality of these features in Western liberal democracy and in Islam, we can clearly see that the quality which Islam provides for the same subject, for the same area of concern, is much, much higher. And I'm not saying this because, alhamdulillah, we are all Muslims. I'm saying this because other scholars who have been fair, and there are a few of them in the West. One of them is Noah Feldman. He wrote a book on the on the fall and the rise of Islamic State. Noah Feldman is a professor of law at Harvard. He's also a member of Council of Foreign Relations. And in his book, which I had the opportunity to review, and if Nuru is interested, I can share this review with some of you as part of the material. He made two very important points. He said, for example, that the Islamic State is far more equitable than the Western liberal democratic state. And he said the Sharia is far more, provides more justice than the current parliament, that produces a legislation in a Western liberal democratic, Western liberal democracy. And some of his arguments, which I don't have time now to go into, is that he said, in the first place, those who produce the fatwas, those who produce the Sharia in Islam are completely independent of the state. He said, but the parliamentarians are paid by the state. The parliamentarians are susceptible to the lobby system, which the Western liberal democracy has accommodated. Therefore, you can literally go into the corridors of any parliament, sell your ideas, or bribe your way through and get a legislation of what you want. You can't do that with Imam Malik. You can't do that with Shafi. You can't do that with their students. You can't do that in that kind of tradition, because these are people who in the first place are not paid by the state. They sometimes, or most of the time, take a position quite different and against the position that those who are ruling might want. And several of them have had to go to prison because of their positions, and they never budged. And some of them, of course, were plugged, publicly. So he said this system that has got this independence, and these people have earned that position. They are never appointed by any particular authority. They rise within the community, and they earn this particular position through their knowledge, through their steadfastness, through their tenacity to truth, and the quality of their character, which has been attested by people around them. So he said this is a far more independent system. It's much a stronger legal system than what we have in the West today. So there are lots of these that you find in the work of people like Noah Feldman. And it's important also to make reference to the fact that some of the heroes of Western liberal democracy, like Thomas Jefferson, got a lot of the ideas that are celebrated in the West actually from the Quran. And a lot of you are aware that Jefferson's copy of the Quran, with the notes he personally made on the copy, are currently in the Library of Congress in the United States. I don't know if scholars have studied those notes to trace those ideas that Jefferson was famous for. So what I'm basically trying to say here is that if we just go by simply saying, okay, liberal democracy has certain features which Islam also has, and because of that, it fits in, I think we'll be making a mistake, because if we lose the context and if we lose a deeper analysis of the quality of those ideas in the Western liberal democratic context, then I think we will be doing a disservice, to Islam. And therefore, we need to really go deeper and understand the real difference. I will come to that difference later. I want to conclude with it. But so what I'm basically suggesting is that, yes, there are similarities or there are common spaces but I think we need to constantly recognize the fact that the Islamic provisions for the same are much, much, much higher in quality. So for me, it is like democracy is trying to catch up with Islam. It has not quite done so. And it is for us as Muslims to help democracy become what it aspires to become, because it lacked something which it sort of left behind, and which is God's guidance. Now, I'm not saying we should Islamize democracy. I would rather say that we bring out the democracy in Islam in a way that will make democracy recognize that, yes, this is all along what I had always wanted to be. And here I am now. And then democracy will now come into that. Now, we have not done that as scholars to bring out that democracy in Islam and to show that the quality of that democracy in Islam is much higher than the democracy that we are being dished out at the moment. So let me make two more points. I'm conscious that time is not there to go further. And the 2 points I want to make is, one, I don't know which one I will start with, but don't mind if the sequence doesn't fit. Let me just bring them. I want you to remember that the West is what it is today because of its contact with Islam. Now, maybe, I don't know how many have read the work of George Makdisi. George Makdisi is an Arab Christian Palestinian who did his PhD maybe 30, 40 years ago, or maybe longer, on, he compared the rise of universities in the East and in the West. And he discovered that the universities in the West, when you examine their own papers and their, their documents, you find that the concept and the documents that establish are exactly like a copy of the Muslim universities. And this is, again, establishing that link. Because as you know too well, even if you Google, you find that the oldest university in the world was that of Qarawiyyin, sometimes 859 or thereabouts. And the next university in the world is that of Azhar. And the next university in the world is that of Timbuktu. And the first university in the West was in Bologna, in Italy, a little north of Florence, which started in 1088. Now that itself tells you that all this intellectual development in the West are indebted to what the Muslim world has already produced. And that is the kind of point I want us to start reflecting and to see that the West actually needs to be helped by Muslims, because they picked those ideas but then they missed something. And that is what I'm going to conclude with. What is that thing that they have missed? They have a deficient epistemology. Epistemology is nothing, don't worry about the big word. It's basically a theory of knowledge, right? I mean, that theory that tells you what is knowledge and what is opinion. How do you distinguish truth from speculations? And that is important, because if you don't have a way of knowing, then anybody can say anything, and then it becomes knowledge. So there has to be a way of filtering and making sure what comes through this filter is actually knowledge. So I can rely on it, I can work on it, I can depend on it. Now, that epistemology in the West is different from, and what makes the West basically to start to think differently from the Islamic world is basically this epistemology. Now, epistemology is always built on what is called ontology. Ontology is the hierarchy of being. The fact that, you know, in terms of being, you have like a pyramid. You have, in the Islamic ontology, we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the top of that pyramid. And then after him, the prophets, after him, the salihin, the scholars, until we come down based on both knowledge and the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is again the issue of morality and law, the issue of state and religion. Now, when the West dispensed of the Holy Roman Empire, and they rode on that wave, unfortunately, they went ahead and dispensed of God himself, like I said, in the beginning of the 19th century. And therefore, they now have an ontology where instead of man, instead of God, it is man that sits on that hierarchy of being. And that man thinks that he knows enough to dispense with God. And this is the thinking in the West, that God doesn't really matter, even if he exists, because they think reason alone is enough. And this kind of epistemology with a deficient, created or crafted on a deficient ontology, is the basic problem of the West today. And this is what has actually produced this unbalanced world. This is what has led the West to create the huge environmental crisis we are facing. This is what led the West to produce the huge financial crisis, the huge social crisis. As you know, some of the major problems in the West today, you know, one of the major diseases that they suffer is loneliness. And because we don't care to read the statistics, look at the number of people who hang themselves in the US. People here are struggling to go to US to earn a living, thinking that it's going to be a better world. But there are far more people who commit suicide in the US or even in Europe, even in advanced societies that have copied Europe, like Japan. Japan, a few years ago, had to create a ministry of loneliness with a minister for loneliness, because it's a huge national problem. Now, this is this unbalanced development, because you have a deficient epistemology, because you have a deficient ontology. So your vision of the world, your way of looking at the world, your way of organizing the world becomes deficient, it becomes faulty, it creates problems. And a lot of the problem the world is facing is largely created by this West that has lost its touch with God, and therefore it made that mistake that it thinks that it can craft this simply because it can go, it can create all the technology. But even the technology that the West is proud of, you can trace it back again to Muslim scholars, because algorithm is the mother of all computing. And where did they get algorithm from? So again and again, you can go on and on and on. Let me see if I can summarize. The point I'm making is that there is a dimension. In addition to the good things that have been said by both Professor Nurain and Ibrahim Tahiru, I want us to start thinking of democracy as an attempt by a people who thought they knew better and are only discovering that in fact they have left something behind. They are not quite sure what it is. We as Muslims should now be able to help them, but we cannot help them when we are deep down discussing about Aqidah, about Bid'ah, with all these, if you like, permit my use, silly things that really don't cut any ice if you look at the current problem that we are facing as a community. So we need to get our scholars to get deep, to now understand the intellectual history of the West and the deficiencies of Western thinking, and then come up with those positive elements that can correct, because the world today is actually exhausted. It's looking for what to do, where to go in terms of economy, in terms of politics, in terms of environment, in terms of social organization, in terms of almost everything. And where is the solution? It is right there in the Quran. It is for us as Muslims to now come out and bring out those solutions so that the West and the world altogether can easily see that, oh my God, this is where we lost it. And this is the way to go. This confusion will continue if we do not resolve the epistemological problems that the West is facing. But we have to sharpen our own. We have to engage the West. We don't engage the West, in the way some Muslim scholars do. I forgive them because they have not studied the intellectual antecedents of the West. They just simply assume these are kuffar or these are these. Before you engage a civilization, you need to go to its roots and understand what exactly, makes that frame of mind. And so my final words are to say that we as Muslims should be far more confident. We should know that we have the best thing in the world, and it's our duty to first understand the West deeply, read their scholars, understand their thinking, puncture it where it needs to be punctured, accept it but modify it where they get it right. But we have the campus, we have the what it takes, and therefore we need to have a deeper understanding of our own Islam. When we talk about rule of law, we should know when Allah says atu beauty min abwabiha, it's not just physically coming to houses through their proper gates, but it talks about the rule of law. It talks about the due processes. So it is this kind of renewed understanding of some of these things in the Quran that relate to or speak to our issues today that we require to be able to give guidance, to the world. So yes, democracy is a necessity, just like the banking system, until you can have your own banking system. So we should take it, but we should participate in it in a way that will direct it, that will guide it. And so we should not shy away from it, but we should participate, and the opportunities will be there if you participate, to engage and to modify until you are able to bring something that everybody can see is better than what we have now, and the world will be the better for it. I hope these few words have, in a way, added to the clarity that we are all looking for. So democracy needs not to be Islamic. It has elements that are drawn from Islam, but it's not adequate, and it is for us to make it better. Maybe by the time we finish the job, we may not call it democracy anymore. It could be something else. Thank you very much. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Thank you very much, Bugaje, for enlightening submission. think the Bugaje's solution is very, very clear. One will even wonder how to summarize. But I think two important points are that at the beginning of the submission, it speaks about how Islam and Islamic scholars have really contributed in inspiring this, the evolution of ideas of democracy. And he talked about Renaissance and how that actually culminated to the democratic system as we see today. And such an important point made by Dr. Usman Bugaje is that he argued that Islam, in terms of the principles of democracy, is even more democratic. And it's our responsibility to demonstrate to the world how democratic or the advancement of some of the principles of democracy that are provided in the teachings of Islam. And he mentioned some things around freedom of choice and association, the issue of equity and equality that is embedded in the principles of democracy. We thank you most sincerely for this enlightening submission. Now I quickly invite the next speaker. Inshallah, we are going to share the papers presented here, and the recordings also will be shared with the participants.